1. Another one bites the dust. Nothing brought the Daylittle family together like a funeral. In other Southern families, it was weddings. Large, cheerful gatherings centered around a princess in a white gown, promises of fidelity and eternal love, and the addition of another strong Southern family to the core of the collection. Grudges and old arguments were shoved neatly aside as long as the band played, the alcohol flowed, and girdles could be tolerated. For one day, if not a moment longer, most Southern families could come together for a wedding. The New Orleans Daylittles couldn't find it in themselves to share in the joy associated with this ritual, however, as they generally found their family too big as it was. Too many people meant too many opportunities for corruption, public humiliation, error, or liberalism. Fewer people could be better corralled, and perhaps, with fewer people, the family's original wholesomeness and grandeur could be resurrected. Reputation, of course, was everything. In Daylittle philosophy, if a family didn't have its reputation, it hadn't anything at all. And so it was with a conservative but enthusiastic joy that the family celebrated the death of its own. The caterers were late, but the bar was open, and Richard Daylittle's funeral was in full swing. Gracie Daylittle stood ensconced in a corner, sipping on a cranberry juice cocktail, watching the preening peacocks she called her family with mild disgust. Glancing at her watch, she saw that she'd hardly been home for 15 minutes, and already she was beginning to feel sick. She shouldn't have come. A peal of laughter redirected Gracie's attention across the room. The laugh was high and bright, intended to turn heads and raise eyebrows. Annette Daylittle, swathed in a black satin suit, smiled prettily into her champagne flute. With cousins by marriage vying for her attention, Annette was deep in her element, and if she felt an iota of grief at her late husband's brother's passing, she kept it, like so many potential wrinkles, carefully away from her face. Gracie hadn't meant to stare and certainly hadn't meant to catch her mother's eye. But when she saw the flicker of irritation pass over Annette's face, she knew she had her mother's attention. Annette excused herself from her entourage and made her way to Gracie's side, her expression having gone from merry to stern in just a few strides. "My God." The woman stopped before her daughter, her expression pinched, mildly revolted. "You wore cowboy boots to your uncle's funeral." Annette sighed, let her shoulders droop just a little as her gaze flitted briefly to Gracie's drink. "Your hand looks dreadful. You shouldn't have let them take your finger." Gracie lowered her drink to her side, removing the scarred, four-fingered hand from her mother's view. "Sorry, Mama." She glanced down at the dust-covered boots. "I don't own any heels. Not much occasion for uncomfortable shoes in my line of work." Annette disregarded this remark. "At any rate, I'm so glad you made it," she said, with an indifference that belied her words. "You didn't call, so I didn't know if you would. I honestly thought I raised you better than that. I don't know how you expect me to plan an event like this without a proper head count." Annette shook her head, her platinum hair an unmoving helmet around her face. "Didn't you bring anything? A casserole or—" Gracie frowned, incredulity knitting her brows together. "It's a catered event," she said. "Why would I bring a casserole to my uncle's funeral?" Annette's lips parted, but no sound came out as the woman shook her head in disbelief. "It's like you were raised by an entirely different family," she mused with bewilderment. "You don't bring food for the event, Gracie. It's for the grieving family. Charlotte brought her Coca-Cola brown sugar ham. Olivia made a beautiful cream of mushroom bake." Annette threw her hands up, heaved a sigh. "Well, what's done is done. We have another matter to attend at the moment. Please come with me." Without questioning her mother's wishes, Gracie followed behind, eyes cast low. She sensed her family's gaze as she wound her way through the funeral, heard the small intakes of breath as she passed by. She'd never had much in common with her relatives, and the past 10 years had only widened the gap between them. She was sure that as they caught a glimpse of her, curly hair wild and untamed, hips carrying 15 too many pounds, they simply raised their brows and shook their heads. Poor Annette, they were likely whispering, casting sidelong glances at her behind her back. Where did she go wrong with that one? Winding through the crowds, trekking up the stairs, they finally made their way to one of the guest bedrooms. The door was already slightly ajar, and Annette pushed it open to reveal a young woman curled up in an armchair, smoking a joint. Gracie blinked. The young woman was her sister, Tiny. Her eyes grew wide at being discovered, and she hurried to crush the joint out against the sole of her shoe. Her eyes flitted from Annette to Gracie and back again. She clambered to her feet. "Sorry, Mama. I just needed some quiet. Don't bother, Clementine. We have another matter to discuss." Tiny was dressed conservatively in a black dress that hit just above her knees. The scoop neck revealed strong collarbones. She was tall, even for a Daylittle. Her hair was still red, though it had dulled to a copper with the years. It had grown curlier, though. Gracie couldn't keep her eyes off her. The girl had been 11 years old the last time Gracie had seen her. "Mama, what's going on?" Tiny's voice was tremulous as she wrapped her arms around her torso. Annette gave Tiny a sharp look before returning her attention to Gracie. "Your sister is pregnant," Annette announced, her voice all ice and vinegar. Gracie could practically taste the sting in her words. The older woman turned calmly to Tiny, whose face had gone white. "How far along are you exactly?" Tiny opened her mouth, shook her head. How did... You had the audacity to make an appointment with Dr. Feldman, of all people. His wife and I play bridge on Sundays after church. How could you be so thoughtless?" Tiny scowled. "I thought there was such a thing as doctor-patient confidentiality." "Well, now you know how the world actually works. Camille says you're about 10 weeks along. Is that right?" Tiny's nostrils flared, and for a moment it looked as though she might refuse to answer. But suddenly her shoulders sagged, and she just nodded. Annette returned her attention to Gracie. "I'm sure you understand that this is a situation I absolutely cannot abide. So until a better alternative presents itself, you need to take Clementine back to Texas with you. She simply cannot stay here." The pronouncement struck Gracie like a pillow upside her head. Take Tiny back to Texas with her? She was so shocked she forgot to breathe. Tiny, for her part, was breathing enough for them both. She seemed to be hyperventilating. "You're kicking me out of the house? Are you serious? Mama, I can't go live in Texas. My entire life is here." "If you hadn't whored yourself out and gotten knocked up out of wedlock, we'd not be having this conversation. What do you think people are going to say?" This, Gracie realized with dawning disgust, was the heart of the problem. Annette wasn't worried about her daughter's welfare. This was not a question of moral support and options. This was a matter of public humiliation. Although the world had moved on at a liberal pace, the New Orleans Daylittles still considered having a child out of wedlock the worst display of human vulgarity, right up there with feminism and hot pants. "Well, I can't just live with Gracie. I won't. Mama, we barely even know each other. You can't foist me off on her like that." Gracie bit her lip, nodding. Foist is a good word. Well, of course it is. She went to LSU after all, Gracie thought idly. Did she graduate? I should have gone to her graduation. Must have been in May, I assume. Mama didn't mention it. Was I invited? 2 cups raisins. I probably wasn't invited. 4 tablespoons cornstarch. We really don't know each other. What are 21-year-olds into these days? 1½ teaspoons cinnamon. 2 tablespoons cider vinegar. A familiar rumble began in the lower cavities of Gracie's chest. Gracie swallowed, gave her head what she hoped was an invisible shake. Not now, she thought, panic rising in her throat. Can't you see I'm busy here? Come back later when I can at least write this down. But the recipe was running full steam ahead, pushing all other thoughts aside, and no amount of cajoling would shame it into more appropriate behavior. With a small sigh, she let the recipe run its course, hoping at least it was a short one. Funeral raisin pie. 2 cups raisins. 2 cups water. 1½ cup sugar. 1½ teaspoons cinnamon. 4 tablespoons cornstarch. 2 eggs, separated. 1/4 teaspoon salt. 4 tablespoons melted butter. 2 tablespoons apple cider vinegar. 1 9-inch baked pie shell. Bake to the tune of Here by Alessia Cara. Preheat oven to 350 degrees. In a saucepan, combine raisins, 1½ cup water, and 1 cup sugar and bring to a boil. If nobody notices you're uncomfortable, don't worry. Most people only care about themselves. Combine the remaining 1/2 cup water and 1/2 cup sugar, cornstarch, egg yolks, and salt. Add to raisin mixture. This is one of those times when raisins are acceptable. Unlike when you expect to find chocolate chips in a cookie, only to find this supposedly healthful alternative. At funerals, sadness should imbue everything, including pies. Cook until thick, stirring constantly. Remove from heat and add butter and vinegar. If the funeral is for a loved one, add extra vinegar. It keeps unwanted conversation at bay. Pour mixture into baked pie shell. Bake until golden brown, about 10 minutes. Eat alone, standing in the corner, waiting for the proper moment to make your escape. Gracie, what's the matter with you? Has living in the middle of nowhere with those blue-collar people made you stupid? The recipe wrapped itself up just in time for Gracie to discover that Annette had been addressing her. Gracie faltered. She had no idea what her mother had said. Even Tiny was staring at her like she had a second head growing from her neck. I'm sorry, she stammered. Did you ask me something? I asked if it would be too much of an inconvenience for you to take your sister home with you when you leave. When are you planning to leave? Annette's words were hardly making sense. Was she really saying Tiny should live with her? After 10 years apart, reunited by an untimely embryo at their uncle's funeral, Gracie wasn't so sure that this was the most auspicious beginning for a relationship. Besides, Gracie had lived alone for 10 years. Did she even know how to share space with someone, let alone 2 someones? I was planning to leave in the morning, she said, her voice coming out hoarse. Tiny stared daggers in her direction. She realized then that she was supposed to object to the entire situation and give Tiny an out. But what could she say? Annette wasn't really asking. Surely Tiny knew that. Annette gave a small nod and turned back to her youngest daughter. Good. That gives you time to pack your things. I'll have Matola pack up whatever you don't take. Would you like me to store the boxes, or shall I forward them on to Gracie's? Do whatever you want, Tiny shouted, her eyes wide and wild with disbelief. How the Christ am I supposed to care what you do with a room full of bullshit right now? Are you seriously kicking me out of my own home? Daddy would never have done this to me. Annette's expression did not soften when she said, "Then I suppose it's a good thing that your father is dead, and I'll thank you to not use that kind of language in my house. Now, I consider this matter closed. Tiny, you can leave the keys to your car in your room." Tiny's jaw dropped. Her hands fell to her sides. "You're taking my car? What am I supposed to do for transportation?" Annette gave a dismissive flick of her hand. "Take the bus." Gracie cleared her throat. "We don't have buses in Love and War," she said. Annette laughed. "If they don't have buses, the town's probably so small you don't even need a car. Problem solved. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have guests to attend to. I expect both of you downstairs in a few minutes to help. Richard was your uncle, after all. He's no blood relation of mine." Without waiting for a response, Annette Doolittle turned and left the room, leaving the door open behind her. The two sisters stood a moment in silence before Tiny burst into tears. "Bitch!" she barked, burying her face in her hands. "How could she do this to me? How could she? This is my home." Tiny's words struck a chord in Gracie's heart, and she took a tentative step toward her sister, intending to put her arms around her. But the younger Doolittle stepped away, shaking her head. "You better get downstairs," she said, wiping away snot with the back of her hand. "Mama will be pissed if you don't come running, and God knows you don't want to upset Mama." Gracie didn't move. She registered Tiny's words accurately as the admonishment they were. She watched her sister cry a moment before saying, "What was I supposed to tell her, Tiny?" When her sister didn't reply, Gracie pressed on. "You don't have to come if you don't want to. She can make you move out of the house, but she can't make you leave New Orleans. You could— I don't come into my trust fund for another 4 years," she said. There was a sharpness in her voice that Gracie could read at 30 paces. "I don't have any money, and I don't want to talk about this with you." "Why didn't you tell her that I can't come with you? Why did you just stand there and take it? If you'd said no—" "Tiny." Gracie's voice came out softer than she expected. "You don't just say no to Mama. Nobody—" "That's ridiculous. Mama's not some kind of god, for Christ's sakes. You could have told her no." "Fine," Gracie amended. "I can't stand up to Mama. She's the entire reason I left New Orleans to begin with. She controlled every aspect of my life, from my bank account to my friendships to the way I wore my hair. The only way I could live my own life was to leave. She knows that. It's why she called me here in the first place. She knew I'd have to take you in because I can't tell her no." "Well, thanks for nothing," Tiny said, dabbing lightly at her face to avoid smudging her makeup. "Your complete spinelessness just assassinated my entire life." Gracie tried to find a suitable response to her sister's accusation, but found that she agreed with Tiny's assessment. The assertion stung like jalapeno juice in a paper cut. "I'm sorry you feel that way." She paused before continuing. "I'm staying at the Marriott," Gracie said. "I'll pick you up around 10. It's a long drive back to Love and War," she said. Tiny made no reply as she turned her back to Gracie, her shoulders shaking. Gracie watched her sister a minute before slipping out the door and heading downstairs.